We are working on enhancing the laptop store project from the YByte Python curriculum available at www.ybyte.in. Previously, we saw how we could get users to give, let's say, multiple preferences for every specification, for example, with a comma separated value. Now, taking that forward in a logical direction, let's say we allow our users to also specify a range of values. And this is particularly, let's say, relevant in case of price. Many times people have a consideration like, the price that I'm looking for should be between, let's say, 20,000 to say 40,000 rupees. Or perhaps somebody might say, look, I want RAM between 4 GB and 8 GB and something like that. So basically, what we need to do is to ask my user both the extremes. So min and max, and form the query accordingly. Now there's a slight improvement possible that, if let's say min or max not provided, then we can take them to be, for example, min could be 0 depending on context, max could be something which is much larger than, let's say, whatever our models have, right? Now notice that range is only allowed on speed, RAM, screen size, and price, which is logical because these are the quantities where, there's a numerical value which we are putting, and hence a range makes sense. Now, really, in order to implement this, we need to do two things. First, we need to take the user input in a way that range could be accepted. And then we need to form the query accordingly. So let's talk about range user input. Basically, I can say that, look, just like comma separated values were like multiple values. Now I can say, let me have my user enter R to say sort of give me a range. And when this happens, I can get the min and a max range, let's say, from the user's response. And also to facilitate this whole process, I can display the units as shown here. So basically the code I'm going to use is something like this. I will use another dictionary here. Notice this dictionary is containing all the units for the specific, let's say, parameters or specifications. So speed, for example, gigahertz, RAM, GB, and so on and so forth. So again, these quantities have become the keys, and here it's gigahertz, GB, and all are, let's say, the values. Now, what I do is that, look, I ask my player to say that, okay, either you tell me, let's say, whatever preference you have in a comma separated manner. You could tell me, let's say, one value. If you could also tell me a range by R, and if the response is R, like I said, I go and ask my player, well, tell me what's the minimum you want, and here I use this dictionary units, so that becomes like minimum gigahertz, minimum, let's say, GB, maximum GB, and so on, and that becomes my user choice. Now, user choice is quite interesting here. In the earlier case, basically user choice was directly coming from the response, but here we are processing the response a little bit, and then we are, let's say, creating a user choice, let's say between string min to string max. Now first let's do this much so that we understand the next part will make more sense. So I get back here to my code. Like I said, let's get to this point where we are asking, let's say, for preferences. Like I said, here I have a situation that, look, user choice KK is directly mapped to the input, but I will change this. I'm going to say, well, let's take this as, let's say, user response. So a new variable created here. User response is your preference for so and so. No preference, give me none. Multiple, give make it comma separated. And let's say range, I say R. Now, there are two conditions here. Either the response given is an R, or response given is, let's say, not an R. So we will go with that. I'm going to say, look, if my user response is, oh, so it should be response to be clear. So let's just make it response. If user response is, let's say, equal to, say, R, so we can just put a small comment here. Range, range, let's say, provided. Now we need to find out what's the min and the max. So we will ask just two more questions. We'll just ask, let's say, for example, min is equal to, let's say, input, say minimum. Let's just do that first. And I can just go and say, well, max equals to, say, input, say, maximum. Now, when I do this, remember my user choice has to be created from this. So I just go and say my user choice for this particular spec KK. KK is equal to, basically I'm just going to concatenate all of this as strings. So string min dash, so let's say plus, say, dash, and plus, let's say, str, say, max. So that will become like, say, 2 to 4, or say 20,000 to 40,000, something like that. this is the situation when the user response is an R. If user response is, let's say, not an R, so if the user response is not an R, which means that's a situation like earlier. It could be a multiple, let's say, choices. It could be none. It could be a single preference. Whatever it is, doesn't matter. I can go with the earlier method itself. I can go and say user choice KK is equal to, say, user response. Now, first, let's see this working. So I'll just put an input statement here. Let's say input, statement here at this point, so that after the query is created, after the preference is taken, we, let's say, check what's going on. So when I run this piece of code, let's say I want to, say, well, look, I have a preference for brand and let's say RAM. Now for brand, I just say probably, let's say W Dell. For RAM, I want to give a range. So I give, let's say, R. Now it tell me the minimum. So for example, I can go and say, well, 2 GB should be minimum. Now this interface clearly needs some improvement, and maximum, but probably I can say maybe, well, 16 GB. So I'm getting everything essentially, or perhaps I can say maximum, let's say 8 GB, right? So if I look at this, my notice my basically my query has formed 2 to 8. I'm just going to end this for now. If I look at my user choice, that's a dictionary. Remember, RAM has become, let's say, 2 to 8. Now I'm going to keep it this way because we'll process this later on, to create the query, which actually got created here, but this has to be fixed, right? This is not the right way to query. However, I'm going to improve this interface. Remember, it's a little bit hard, when I'm asking, let's say, minimum, maximum, it will be helpful if I tell the units of what I'm asking. So that immediately tells the player, it makes it more, let's say, clear. So what I will do is I'll get back to my code. Like we discussed earlier, I'll create a dictionary here. Basically, I'm creating a dictionary for the units. Remember, range is available only for these metrics, these features. So I'm just creating a dictionary with the units. So this will help me because now I can come in here and I go and say, well, look, minimum, let's say plus units, say KK. So this unit is a new dictionary. And I can give a little bit of, let's say, space over here. So that kind of makes it a bit more, let's say, easy on the response, right? So say units, say for example, KK, say plus, and let's say something like this. Let's once again see this work. So for example, let's say I want to specify a preference for speed. Now, the moment I do this, it tells me, look, tell me your preference for speed, 2 gigahertz, 3 gigahertz, 3.5, and so on. Let's say I want to provide a range. Now, when I give it a range, it tells me minimum gigahertz. I will add a space later on to this, so that becomes even easier. So I can go and say, well, minimum I need, let's say, 2.8 gigahertz, and maximum probably I need, let's say, maybe 3.3 gigahertz. Now, the interesting bit is this, right? That when I'm providing a range, I need not provide exactly these values because the program should go and search what are the laptops, let's say, that are falling in this range. So that's an interesting part of it. Of course, we will now have to do the next part, which is to create a query. But like I said, I'm going to just create a new space over here. So that's just a bit of formatting, but it does make a difference. Now moving on to the next part, which is creating the query. Now this is actually quite interesting. Remember, we are letting the user choice to come in as as it is, essentially. So min, let's say a dash max. So we are just going to search for the situation. Have we got, let's say, this kind of a character inside user choice? If we have, then I know a range has been provided. I will figure out, look, what is the minimum of this and what is the maximum of this, what range has been provided. And I can figure this out by splitting. Again, remember, user choice KK is a string. I'll split this with, let's say, this dash as a character. I will look at the first value of this list. So this split gives me a list. First value is the min, second value is the max. Now remember, the situation has to be that my basically my the quantity that I'm looking at has to be more than the min and less than equal, so more than or equal to the min and less than or equal to max. So that's exactly what I'm doing, except that there's a small little technicality that, look, the laptop specifications are always let's say a numerical part plus the unit. So basically, for example, we have RAM, say 2 GB, say 4 GB. So GB is the unit here, when we are doing this comparison, we need to look at the first part of it, which is the numerical part, and that is exactly what this complicated looking thing is doing. Here I am looking at that dictionary. I'm finding out the value for, let's say, that particular laptop. What is the value for this quantity? I'm splitting that with space, and I'm looking at the zeroth character. Now this will work because, like I said, it's like 2.15 gigahertz, or let's say 9 inch and so on. Yeah. However, for price, it will be different because remember, this will have to be one. The reason being, price is always specified as INR 2000. So when I split, let's say, this string with, let's say, a dash, the 20,000, which is what I'm interested in, is in fact on the item number one. So that's what I'm doing for price, which means we have to do this a little bit carefully. Let's kind of put the contours first, and then we will, complete this whole thing. So I get back to my code over here. Now this has to be done a little bit carefully. Basically, I just ask myself a question. Look, if my user choice is none, then as usual, query is not impacted by you, by this particular metric. So I ignore it. There, I had this multiple preferences. Now I'm going to put one more elif over here. I just go and ask myself, look, if this dash is in, so in, user user choice, right? So when I do this, so if this particular thing, there's a range, so range has been provided, let's say. Now, like I said, we will figure out if we are looking at price or, let's say, something else. However, either way, we will first find the min and the max. So I'm just going to say range, say min, is equal to user choice kk, dot split. So remember, this split has to happen with respect to this dash character because always min dash max in the user choice. And I'm going to look at the first item of it. Likewise, the range, let's say range max here would be, so range max would be split with, let's say, 1 as the index. So that's my, now having obtained the minimum and the maximum value of the range, we will proceed to create the query. This is a little bit detailed, but the idea is logical that, look, we want the specification to be more than the minimum and less than the maximum. Also keep in mind, every specification has a number and a unit. Here we are only comparing the number. So that's why it looks a little daunting, but it's quite logical. So I'm going to start with, let's say, this. I'm going to say, okay, look, query has to be formed. First thing first, I must create a, let's say, a bracket over here. We spoke about this. You need the bracket so that this, for this metric, the query is, let's say, controlled, is calculated in the right manner. Now I'm going to use a float here. Laptop, let's say, dot split. So I will split the metric. Remember, unit, number and unit. So we're getting, getting the number. So I put a 0 over here. This should be equal to, so this should be actually greater than equal to, basically, say range min. Now notice we're going to, now notice range min is a string, and that's why this operation is valid. Now I will complete the query by saying query is equal to, let's say, query, say query plus. Again, have to be a little bit careful. Remember, the two conditions have to be inside an and. So I just go and put, let's say, and say float, laptop. Okay, so the float has to be ending here. There's a mistake, right? So there has to be a parenthesis here. So let's say laptop, can copy this whole thing. And in fact, I can laptop, let me paste it here, and then we will take a look. So basically we're saying, and float, let's say laptop split 0 is, say, less than and equal to, and plus, say, range max. And again, I must end this query with the closing bracket and plus and add. Now this is definitely, a little bit error prone. So do it slowly, very easy to make a mistake. We will first look at our query here before we move forward. In fact, the game is almost done. However, remember that this will work only for RAM, screen size, and speed, because in the price, we will have to look at split 1, right? We'll talk about that later. First, let's see this working, because once this works, the other one is straightforward after that. So let's say I want to specify the speed. I want to give a range here. Let's say I want to say minimum is 1.8, maximum is 3.1. Now, keep in mind that when I'm giving a range, I don't have to exactly follow this. I expect my program to go and find out what are the laptops that meet, let's say, this range. Now, when I look at all right, so the query looks almost correct, except that I need some spaces in between, let's say, these, let's say the mints and I can fix that. So there has to be a space over here and as well as a space, let's say, over here. And I think that should be okay. I can actually give an extra space over here. That should be fine. So when I now say I want to specify speed and I say, well, I want to provide a range, let's say 1.8 minimum and say 3.2 maximum. If I look at the query is looking quite good and clean, right? So basically I'm saying, look, let's look at the laptop speed, whatever it is, split that with space as the metric and look at the first one, convert that to float. If that is more than 1.8 and that number is less than equal to 3.2, then we are good to go. So when I do this, in fact, you'll notice that all the speeds are between these ranges, right? So we found all the models, but the speeds are all in this range. In fact, this is already working. Let's see this once again. Let's say I want to specify, for example, RAM and say brand. Now remember, I can specify only RAM as a range. So brand, let's say I say W Dell. Now RAM I want to say, well, between say two, so let's say an R is not provide a range, say minimum 2 GB and maximum say let's say 12 GB. Right? So of course for me it will be 2, 4 or 8. When I do this, my query is making sense. Laptop brand is equal to Dell, and because of the parentheses, this has to happen. So every laptop brand must meet this requirement and it must be a Dell laptop. Notice this is an and, this is also an and this entire thing is inside a parenthesis. When I run this, I get all those Dell laptops which have, let's say, between 2 to, let's say, 12 GB RAM, which means 2, 4, and 8. And this is all the list. Pretty interesting, quite, nice. Now, obviously, this, like we discussed, will work only with RAM, screen size, and let's say price. We'll look at example for screen size a little bit later, but before that, let me go and fix it right away. Basically, the computation of min and max does not change. I will just put a condition over here. If let's say KK is not equal to say price, then we'll do this. Just have to be a little bit careful here. Say else, well, it's actually keep it verbose, that's okay. I will, for price, I will look at, let's say, metric one. And like I said, the reason is it's always INR, space 2000, 4000, whatever, right? So with this, I expect this to work for price as well. Now let's say I will go and say, well, price is my specification that I care for. And I want to make sure that, so these are all the prices available, 20, 30, 40,000. Of course, this is not really valid because, the prices have now become different, right? So I just go and say, well, put a range here. Let's say I want a laptop between, say, 15,000 rupees to no more than, say, 35,000 rupees. So these are my two ranges. Notice a one over here. Now I expect all the prices to fall inside this range, and indeed they have fallen there because I'm just fixing it that way. Let's look at one more example where we specify screen size as well as, let's say, a price. So I just go and say, well, I have a choice for screen size and say price. So I'm very, very, let's say, sensitive about both of these. I want a screen size to be, say, I want a small laptop perhaps. So I want to put a range for screen size between, let's say, 9, minimum is 9 and maximum is, let's say 12.3, maybe just a number, which means I'm looking at only 9 and 12 actually in this case. Price for me, I'm very careful about the price, so I don't want to spend. I want to give you a range that look minimum is say 15,000. Let's be reasonable. I don't think I'll find anything less than that. And maximum is probably, let's say 20, say 20, say 30,000. So if I do this, well, that's my query. Looks quite complicated. Look, all my laptops that I found are between 15 and 30,000. In fact, I could have gone further, and they have all 9 inches or 12 inches screen. Now, very interesting. This whole thing makes it quite realistic. Very good practice, let's say, in formation of query, string methods, eval function, all of that is going on quite nicely here. Obviously, a little bit error prone. But go through it slowly, try to understand the logic, and how this is working. It's actually quite interesting. In general, if you think this way of learning where we are building activities to understand how things work, um, it is in general, creating activities makes concepts so much more vivid. Look at our website www.ybyte.it, because that is how we learn Python programming. Take care. Thank you so much. Bye bye.